Okay, so we are back with the part 2 of working with background images and graphics in CSS. And this video is going to be dedicated to the tutorial where I will demonstrate how you will apply background images and graphics in your own websites. So wanted to give you a quick overview as to what this page in Canvas looks like currently. There is a link right up here to the tutorial files so that you can download that and work from that. I went ahead and printed mine out so that I would have it available here in front of me, which works a lot better for me, though I know that we don't all have access to printers currently. Being able to look at that in a separate browser window would be a really great idea at this point. There are also a number of sample files that I am using inside of this tutorial and demonstration that you can also download from our Canvas page. So we have an image that I'm going to refer to as the taxi, the waves, the flowers, and then there's also a favicon image in here for you to also play with. Now down below there is information about just an additional bonus lesson that is not at all a requirement for your website. You do not need to practice this. It's just an extra technique for some of you who have wanted to have a slideshow or a carousel of images showing up. This is an example of how to create an animated GIF using Photoshop. And I do have a Photoshop file that is a starter file that you can also download and work on. So that's a totally separate, I'm not going to be demonstrating that today, but if you wanted to practice it, it's there for you. Okay, so I have gone ahead already and started this process so that it wouldn't take up too much time. So I've downloaded the images, I printed my handout, and I've gone ahead and set up Dreamweaver. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over into Dreamweaver right now so that you can see what my files panel looks like. Over here inside of my files panel, I am inside of my testing site. So I left my active website, which for you would be your final website, and I chose to get into my testing site instead. Once I got into my testing site, I created a new subfolder in here called Background Images, or BKG-IMG. And inside of it, I have put those 4 image files that I'm going to be using for this demonstration. So that pretty much takes me into up through step 2 on the handout. And I brought my images in, but what I need to do now is I'm going to be creating a number of HTML files where I can practice these techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and start off here in my folder. I'm going to right click and create a new file. The first file that I'm creating is going to be called large PKG for large background. I'm going to go ahead and right click on my folder again and create another new file. This one is going to be called repeat BKG. And then I have another file to create in here, which is going to be called text over image, text over image. So I have my 3 files in here. I'm just going to go ahead and open them all up so they're available for me. All of them are blank because I'm starting from scratch, so I am going to have to work with a little bit of HTML in here, but mostly we'll be playing around with CSS. The first lesson that we are looking at is how to add in a single large image that will be able to cover the entire background of an element. And in this case, we're going to be applying this background image to the body element. If you recall, the body element, which is what we have down here inside of our tag selector, is the entire browser window. Okay, so remember that we have the head element and then we have the body element. The head is that first portion of your HTML document where all the communicating with the browser is taking place, setting up all of the expectations, where the style sheets are, all of that, and then that the body is where we put the content in that is going to be visible in our web page. So the web page really is the body element. Now, if we put images into the background of the body element or into the background of the HTML element, the expectation is that those are then going to cover the entire browser window. So in this technique, our background image is going to be sourced at a really high resolution so that it's able to cover a very large screen without losing too much quality. This image is going to be responsive, meaning that it is going to grow and shrink as that browser window grows and shrinks. So this is one way to work with a responsive image. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So on your handout notes, you see in here that you want to source a large image. My recommendation is something that's at least about 1920 by 1080 to start with. Once you move on in this field, you will be taking on more advanced methods for bringing in responsive images, which we won't be talking about today. We also want to take that image or asset through Photoshop to optimize it using the Save for Web dialog box. If you were working with a large graphic inside of Illustrator, you could do the same process by going through the Save for Web dialog box there. The goal is to still reduce the overall file size of your image so that because we're loading such a really large image or asset, we want to make sure that we take it down to be the smallest file size that we can possibly get it so that it is not totally taxing our load time. And then what we're going to do is go in and add the CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that right now. So inside of my document, I'm actually just going to go right into the split view in here. And I'm going to be working with an internal style sheet again, just because these are isolated examples and I don't want to have a bunch of style sheets in my tutorial folder right now. So I'm going to go right after the closing of the title element in here. I'm then going to come in and create the opening and the closing style tags. What this means is that I'm creating an internal or embedded style sheet. So inside of my style sheet, I am going to create a rule for the HTML element. Now this is something that we have not done before in this class. So remember that we have the head, we have the body, but we also have HTML, which is the parent of both of them. So HTML is our oldest, furthest descendant away. So it is like the ancestor. It is like the first human, okay? So it is the parent of everything, or it is the parent of the head and the body, let's say that. So I'm going to be using HTML as my element in here to put the image behind, and that is because I don't want there to be any gaps between my background image and the edge of the browser window. So in this, I'm going to go ahead and get started using adding in some of my CSS properties. So I have my style sheet started, I have my selector started. I'm going to come over here into my CSS designer to complete this work so that you can see where we would access this inside of the CSS designer. To get started, I'm going to double click in the dark bar up here and my top panel group so that I can have more room dedicated to my CSS designer. You can see in here that I have an internal style sheet, which is noted by the style tag inside of my sources. And then down here under selectors, I have already created that selector for the HTML element. I'm going to go ahead and jump over into the background category, which is where we load background images and graphics. The very first thing that I'm going to get to in here is going to be the background image, and I'm going to click on my folder next to URL to browse to get the image that I'd like to use. So inside of my background image in here, I have this image called Awesome Image. Awesome Image is going to be the image file that I'm working with. So for this particular one, you can see in here that it's 2400 by 1600. So it's 2400 pixels wide, it's 1600 pixels tall. So I said at least 1920 by 1080 was the one that I suggested in here. So this is definitely at least that large, right? It's a very large file at 515 kilobytes. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. So if I were to have a split view in here right now, let me go into live view right now, what you're going to see in here is a very small portion of that very large image. So we're just seeing one small corner in the upper left-hand corner of that. If I were to be able to show you the entire image, you would know that this is just a very small portion of the upper left-hand corner. In fact, let me go ahead over here and I can show you that image. So here is Awesome Image as a whole, and the portion of it that we're currently seeing right now inside of my Dreamweaver is this small upper left-hand corner portion. So currently, my window in the browser is very small, and my image is very big, so we're only seeing a small portion of it. But the goal of this particular technique is to make sure that we see as much of the full image at all times whenever the browser, at whatever scale the browser is at. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can continue to manipulate that. So again, back over here inside of my background images, we're going to go into something that is called the background size. So I'm moving down here under background position and background size. Normally we would always set the background position, and I would just go right over here to the percentages, and I would say I want it to start on the left edge in this case, and I want it to start at the top. So I want the top left corner of the image to start at the top left corner of my HTML element. Now the next property down here is called background size, and background size is where we are going to define our interest in having this image cover the entire browser window or the entire HTML element. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say cover. Now as soon as I say cover, you can see that the image scaled itself down, and I am seeing now that it is actually covering my entire browser window. So as I make my browser window smaller, I am still covering that space with the full image that we can see in here. Now that looks excellent, except for the fact that down here below, I can see that my image is beginning to repeat. Let me show you that again. As it gets smaller, you can see that my image wants to repeat. If you watch the tutorial or the overview of background images and graphics, you would know that that is the default, which is that whenever you put an image into the background using CSS, it's going to repeat vertically and it's going to repeat horizontally to fill the allowable space. We are definitely going to be changing that. So going back into my background property in here, we're going to go down to background repeat. I don't want this background image to repeat, so this is the normal repeats, right? Repeat on the X, repeat on the Y, or no repeat. And I'm going to go ahead and say no repeat. Now, as soon as I say no repeat, though, what's happening in here is that my image is not repeating, but it's also not filling the entire HTML element the way that I'd like it to. So we actually have a fairly quick fix for that, which is based on the background attachment. When I go down to background attachment and I click and set this to be fixed, that little property and value there is going to make this so that no matter how big my window is, my image will always cover it. In this case, my browser window is now very narrow. So what is going on with the image is that it is showing me as much of the width of the image as it can to still adequately cover from top to bottom. Let's go ahead and see that a different way. If my window here were to get much smaller, so let me take my Dreamweaver and shrink that, you can see that my image is actually, now I see less of the image overall top to bottom because my browser window is very short, but I'm still seeing the full image left to right. So essentially the browser is looking at and saying, can I fit the whole width or can I fit the whole height? And it's going to prioritize one or the other to make sure that our singular image is always at all time covering our entire workspace. So let's go ahead and take that out online. So I'm going to say save all. I'm going to take this out and let's go look at this inside of Chrome. Opening up into Chrome, we see that the full image is showing. The upper left-hand corner of the image is over here on the upper left-hand corner of my browser window. As I scale this, we can see that there's sort of a sweet spot in here when the aspect ratio of the width to the height matches the aspect ratio of the image, and none of my image is really missing at this point. So it's just about there when the image fits perfectly. Now, if I were to make the image shorter or my browser window shorter, I see less of it. If I make it wide, I see much less of it, and you can see the image is actually scaling up and down as we go. Okay, so that is technique number 1. Heading back into Dreamweaver, we're going to go ahead and start our second tutorial. This one is going to be about using a repeating pattern in the background. So we are going to work with a single image in here, and we are going to play around with it repeating on both the X and the Y axis to also fill the background of an HTML element. So I'm going to go into my repeat background file in here, which I already have open, and there's nothing currently active inside of it, but there will be momentarily. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we are going to be setting up for this one. So we have our HTML file for here. We're going to go ahead and create our internal style sheet. So again, after the title element in here, I'm going to come in and add my style tags. This is going to allow me to add internal rules to this document. And for my HTML in here, or for my CSS in here, I'm also going to be applying this to the HTML element. I'm also using this as a way to fill the background. Instead of with one image though, we're going to use a single smaller image and we're going to have that tile out. So I'm going to create my selector for HTML in here, and then I'm going to pop back over into my CSS designer just like we did a moment ago. I see my internal style tag, I see my HTML element in here as the beginning of my CSS rule, and then I'm going to hop back over into my background categories so that I can start to set this one up. So the first thing that we want to do for this one is we're going to skip down into the URL where we are going to load up our our waves graphic. So you can see in here that this one is 300 pixels by 150 pixels for this. It's actually a graphic, we would call this a graphic, and that it weighs a total of 39 kilobytes. If you recall from the overview of using background graphics, even though this one small graphic is going to be repeating many, many, many times in order to cover the background of my web page, it's still only going to cost me 39 kilobytes to use it, no matter how many times it gets used in this way. So again, this is one of those efficiency measures where we can get a lot out of using a background graphic or image in our website. I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and let's just go take a look at how this looks to begin with. Right away, you can see in here that we have filled the screen. And if I were to make my window larger, we're going to see that it fills there. And if I were to make it larger vertically, we're going to see that it continues to fill. So essentially, it's just repeating forever until it is filling the space in here. It's actually going a little bit beyond as well. We just can't see it. So that metaphor of there being a small window and there being all of these images behind it makes a lot of sense right here. So as I start to shrink this up in here, you're going to see that the window is very small, but it's still continuing to fill with my graphic. Okay, so let's go back in here and let's play around with some of these settings that we want to have. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to come down. I'm just going to set the attachment to be at scroll for this one. So these are actually going to scroll with our content. As our content goes up and down on the page, they're also going to go. You could also set this to be fixed. And in that way, our background would stay static and our content would scroll over the top of that. Scroll is the default, so you generally do not have to actually state that. I really wouldn't need to say anything about this unless I wanted to tell it to be fixed instead. The other thing that we want to put in here is that we were going to use this as an example or an opportunity to test out the different repeats. So currently, remember the default is that it is repeating. That's why we see it filling the space. But we could also only repeat it on the horizontal axis right here, the x-axis. The other thing is that we could also only repeat it down the y-axis. And once we have repeated it on only the X or only the Y or even only singularly, then what we can do is we can play around a little bit with the background position. So right now I am moving it on the X axis. So you can see right here it's 16%. I'm going to go ahead and just change that into pixels because I think we understand pixels a little bit better. But when I look at this right now, it's 16 pixels off the left edge is where my graphic is beginning. So as I move this around in here, we can see 100 pixels off the left edge, my graphic is beginning at 100 pixels on the x-axis right here. Now on the y-axis, I can do the same thing. I can move that around and I can have that sit in a very specific place right now. So currently, again, it is set to be fixed there, so it would stay there all the time and the other content would move over the top of it. The other option here is that we could set this back to scroll, and in that case, as our content scrolls or our page scrolls, so does the graphic, it goes with it. For the last technique that we are going to be looking at today, we are going to be putting text over a background image and then styling that text so that we can still see and read the text content and have the background graphic or image present. So I have opened up my last file in here, text over image, and I'm inside of the HTML code here where I'm going to need to create a little bit of HTML code in here just so that we actually have content to place over the top. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm creating a div, and the div is going to get an ID of image container. And then inside of that image container, I am going to have an H2, and the H2 is going to say, this is my headline. So the H2 element is ultimately going to be sitting as the only thing inside of this box, which will be the div called image container. My background image is going to go into the div called image container with the text floating above it. So let's go ahead over here into the CSS designer for this one. And I'm going to add in my internal style sheet a slightly different way. So where the sources are, I'm going to add in and define in page. So I'm going to my sources in the plus, define in page. I end up with my internal style sheet. You can see it up here. Dreamweaver placed it for me in the same location that I would have placed it for myself. So now I can come over here and start to work with the CSS rules that I want to add in here. So the first CSS rule that I'm going to be adding in here is actually going to be done through my, I'm going to do it through code, because what I am doing right now is I'm creating one of those universal selectors in here, and I am going to set this to have the box sizing of border box. So remember that we have the different box models. We have content box, which is the default that we don't have to specify. And then we have border box, which is the box model where as we set the width of an item and then we add in padding and borders, those padding and border values come out of the total width as opposed to being added in addition to the width of the element. So we talked about that when we were working with Flexbox or introducing Flexbox, because that model is going to help keep your math much simpler and make sure that your layouts don't break. We're going to be using that in here as well. So I've got my universal selector in here and my rule that sets the box sizing up. And after that, really everything else I can do inside of my CSS designer. So I'm going to head back over here into the CSS designer. You can see in here that I have my asterisks for my universal selector, and that what we set was the box sizing of border box. So the next thing that I want to do in here is I'm going to create a new rule, and it's just going to be for the body. The body is our browser window, and it also is where we should set the default typeface for our full document. So coming in here to font family, I'm going to be choosing the list that starts with Cambria. So that's going to be a serif typeface in here. And I would oftentimes also set my font size, which I did not do inside of my handout, but I could. So I would set that as being rem. And then generally speaking, I would also come in here and set my text color, which we'll come back and do in a few minutes. Now the next thing that I want to work with, let me get back into my live view so that you can see it. There's my text and here's my image container. I'm going to select on my text as a way for me to activate the div called image container, which I can then come over here to my CSS selectors and add a new rule for the image container. For the image container, I'm going to set a width that's going to be 300 pixels. And I'm also going to have a height, which is also going to be 300 pixels. So I'm setting up a square, which is actually matched to the size of the background image that I processed for this tutorial. Now the next thing that I'm going to do in here is I'm setting a margin on the top and the bottom for 0 and on the left and the right of auto. So I'm going to set that in as 0, I'm going to set that in as 0, and I'm going to set this side as auto, and I'm going to set this side as auto. Now do recall that I can also do that using shorthand if I wanted to, and it would just look like this, 0 pixels and auto. So that gives me the ability to actually specify it, auto, here in shorthand, which is the way that you see it inside of the tutorial handouts being written in shorthand. Now the next thing that I'm going to do in here is I'm going to set the position of this div to be something called relative. Now positioning is not something that we go over in detail in this class, but it's extremely helpful, and we're going to be using it inside of this lesson as a way to move our headline up and down within the div container, image container, without making the image container get any bigger than 300 pixels wide or tall. So setting the box, the div, to have a position of relative means that when I want to position my H2, it's not going to move any other elements out of the way. It's not going to grow the box at all. So I'm going to continue moving forward with this one. The next thing I need to do in here is set the background image. So I'm coming in again into the background category, finding my background image. I'm going to go ahead and browse out there. I'm going to be working with this borage jar image and opening that up. You can see that it comes in right away and it's filling in my space right now. I do not want this image ever to repeat, so I'm going to set it there. And I do want this image to be set to cover, so that's going to be under my background size. I'm going to set this to cover, which just means that if that box grows in any way at all, that image will also grow to contain it. The last CSS rule that I need to do in here is I am going to set up some CSS for my H2, which is going to be the text element here. Go ahead up here at the top, I'm going to set in for my H2 selector since I already know where that's going, and I'm going to come in to my layout property. For the width, I'm going to be setting this in at 100%. That's a little bit awkward because normally our H2s or any headline, any block level element is always going to stretch out to be 100% of its parent element. It's going to expand out and take up space as much as it can to meet 100% of that parent element or of the available space in the parent element. So I'm setting this at 100% though because I'm also going to come back in here for positioning, and I'm going to set this H2 to have absolute positioning. Now when I set an element to have absolute positioning, like this H2 is, inside of the image container, and the image container has a position set to relative. What that means is that now my text item, because it's absolutely positioned, I can move it around anywhere in relationship to the box itself. So with my position set to absolute, what I'm going to do with this now is I'm going to set the top position to 20 pixels. So when I set this to 20 pixels in here, it is going to be moving 20 pixels down from the top left corner of my image container, okay? I want you to take a peek at something really quickly though. I'm going back to the rule for my image container, and I'm going to take this position of relative and I'm just going to turn that off for a minute. Now when I come back into the H2 here, as I move this around, what I'm trying to do with this is I'm setting up my I'm setting up the top and the left position. So when you take a peek at this right now, it's moved from where it should have been initially, and it's moved 100 pixels to the left of its initial position. And it's also moved from where it should have been from the top, it moved down 75 pixels. So once I have absolute positioning on an element, I can actually come in here and move that element around based on where it should have been to begin with. Now when I go back to turning my position for the image container to relative, so I just turn that back on, what you should see now is that the position of the H2 is 70 pixels down from the top left corner here, and it's 119 pixels off from the left edge here. So it's taking its cues and its position from the parent element itself that was set to relative. So before, when I had turned relative off, it was just positioning itself based on where it should have been already. But now with the box being set back to having relative positioning, my element is now positioning itself based on this upper left-hand corner. So 75 down or 70 down and 120 from the left edge of this box. So it changes the way that it works a little bit. Again, if I go back to the image container, I take relative and turn it off, we're going to see that now we are 75 and 19. Okay, so things are a little bit different depending on how we set up the positioning. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that back on, but I'm going to come back into my H2. I'm going to remove the position off the left-hand side. I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to set this back to 20 pixels to begin with. And this is our current position. Now, unfortunately, what we're seeing in here is that the readability of the word this is very challenging because of the fact that there's no contrast between the color of the type and the color of the cork. So we're going to do a little bit more to play with this. So for my H2, I'm going back into the background category, and from the background category in here, I'm going to be setting the background color. So I can have a background color behind my text. When I click on the background color in here though, we are normally by default working with hexadecimal values, which do not provide any transparency. It's always a solid color that you cannot see through at all. For this process, I actually want to be working with a different color mode called RGBA, red, green, blue, and alpha. When I set the RGBA color mode in here, I see it changes down here from having the pound sign to having the RGBA. Red, green, blue, and alpha. It's currently set to 1.00 for the alpha, which is equivalent to 100% solid or opaque. I can change those numbers though. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to set my values in here. They're going to be a little bit different, so I'm just going to type them in by hand. And they are going to be 181 for red, 167 for green, and they are going to be 163 for blue. And then for my alpha, it's going to be 0.80, which is equivalent to 80% in here. Now when I hit return on that, what we're going to see is that we have a light colored and semi-transparent background color behind our text content. And I want to do a couple of other things to kind of work with this. One is, it seems really tight, like the top of my letters and my descenders and my ascenders are really pushing against the edge of that. So I'm going to want to build in a little bit of padding into that H2 so that the element itself is going to grow bigger, taller, but the words are going to be centered in the middle. So we're also going to take the text and we're going to move the text to the middle of that text block. So to do that, I'm going to go into my text category in here, and the first thing is I'm going to set the text align to be in the center, so that moved my text to the center, which is much better in terms of readability already. But I also want to go all the way back to the layout category for this, where I'm going to come into the padding, and I'm going to be setting padding using my shorthand properties. So again, if I have two values for my shorthand, it means the first value is for the top and the bottom, and the second value is going to be for the left and the right. So in this case, I'm putting in 10 pixels and 0 pixels because I don't need any padding on the left and the right because I have plenty of space in there. I do need this element to grow a little bit more. So there we go. I have created a really nice little overlay in here. My text is sitting in a good position. I can still see my image in the background, and I feel like this was a success. I do hope that these tutorials have helped you understand a little bit more about how you might be applying background images or graphics in your final website.